Hi, good evening, everybody. So tonight's topic is going to be about the thyroid, and I thought more or less that I'm going to continue to try to break these topics up into chunks a little bit. So I apologize for those that are joining that are used to watching the whole thing straight on through or coming in later. So when I say goodbye, just log back in and come back and find me again, and we'll have more to say on the topic. So just to be as an introduction, the thyroid is a gland that sits right here in the neck. And so sometimes during an exam, we'll have the patient, we'll put our hand here and we'll have them swallow. Because when you swallow, it causes that thyroid to go up and down just a little bit, and it makes it easier to feel if there's any swellings or lumps or anything in that particular location. Obviously, you don't want to press too hard, because that'll be a little bit troublesome. However, with gentle pressure, you get a sense for what the thyroid feels like. And when you feel a lot of them, you get a real good sense for what a normal thyroid feels like. So basically, it's shaped like a butterfly, as mentioned before, just kind of sits right around in this area. And there are a couple of hormones that it makes. So the thyroid is the big regulator of metabolism, and there's a couple of different kinds of hormones that we talk about a lot when we talk about high thyroid function or low thyroid function. And the way that I usually talk about these is, thank you, in the form of the boss and the worker. So basically, there's a control gland in the brain that's called the pineal gland. It's called the master control center kind of thing. And it's basically the boss. So the boss lives up in here, like deep in the brain, and it secretes a hormone to make the worker work. And so if the worker is not doing a good enough job, like it's slacking off, got his hammock out, basically got his feet up, and the thyroid's not making enough of its product, which is the thyroid hormone, then the boss says, hey, thyroid, it's kind of shouting down at the thyroid, and obviously it can't shout down literally inside the body. So how does it do that? It does that by shouting, by raising its own hormones. And so the TSH is its hormone, and the TSH goes up, and it's the brain's way of saying, hey, you dummy, get to work again, And so when the boss is shouting, the thyroid goes, and basically it tries and tries and tries, and sometimes it can't put out enough hormone to meet the demand, and sometimes it's able to just a little bit more and maybe just swells a little bit more and causes a goiter to form. Goiter just means a swelling of the thyroid of the neck here. And that's essentially the long and the short of it of how the pineal gland shouts down to the thyroid gland like, hey, come on, make more stuff. Occasionally, the thyroid gland, for one reason or another, has its own ideas. It starts to become an overachiever, an overproducer. And when it does that, basically, sometimes it can start making its own thyroid hormones just all on its own. Sometimes the body creates antibodies against those receptors, and so the body's immune system is like, wow, look at that receptor, I better attach to it. And it ends up stimulating that receptor, in other words, turning the on switch on directly in the factory. Might imagine one of those Lucille Ball videos where the little chocolates are going by and then all of a sudden, so basically that would be hyperthyroid, where the thyroid's making too much of those little chocolates kind of stuff, right? And in that case, the thyroid hormone goes up, but the brain, the boss, it's basically floating around flooded with all this hormone, and it says, I don't need to do a thing. And so then the boss gets on the hammock and lays back and isn't shouting at the worker. And so the idea with that is, if you're hyperthyroid, your boss is taking a break and your thyroid's working its butt off, so to say. And if you're hypothyroid, then the thyroid's the one taking the break, and the boss, the TSH, is sitting there shouting at it. So So that's kind of a quick and easy way of thinking about the thyroid hormones, just in a very general sort of way. Obviously, there's lots of details I'm leaving out just for this basic description of it. And so I thought I would think a little bit more in terms of some general principles for thyroid health before getting into some of the details. And so starting off, this is a review of an article from nutritionfacts.org, one of my favorites, of course. And he's got a few articles on there about thyroid disease, thyroid cancer, thyroid health, and some of those we'll do a little bit later probably, but tonight we'll talk about thyroid health. And so the first thing they talk about is too much or too little iodine. So this worker bee, so to say, that in the analogy of the Lucille Ball making little chocolates going by and stuff, well, one of the ingredients in those special little chocolate hormones that it's making is iodine. Iodine is very unique to the thyroid. And in fact, it's one of the ways in which we're able to help image the thyroid as we give somebody radioactive iodine or iodine. And we look to see where in the neck is it soaking up. If there's a hot nodule or something, it's like, woo, there's where that worker bee is going out of control and making too much. Maybe we better go biopsy it or something. So we can use the fact that the thyroid just soaks up iodine as a way of imaging it. And so if you have too much iodine or too little iodine, it can kind of mess up your chocolate factory, so to say. And so in America, which is where we're making these videos, what is the most common source of iodine? It's our salts. This is garden variety Publix iodinized salt. Here I don't tend to use it very much because the more salt you use, the more the blood pressure goes up over time and so forth. However, for many people, the salt has been purposefully had iodine added to it actually as a public health measure. There are some parts of the world where the salt levels in the soil are very low naturally. The one they illustrate in the medical text is some province like in the middle of some highland China or something where it's really, really, really far away from the ocean and there's like no sea salt iodine in there. And so the rates of people being born with too low iodine and then having trouble with their thyroid from birth, basically that causes a condition called cretinism. It really has to do with the way that the brain develops and whether it can get to full intellectual capacity and so forth if there's not enough iodine early on. And so it really does become a public health concern, especially across the countries. So it's good to have a little bit of iodine in the diet, whether you get it from salt or from another source. This is an example of a random seaweed from our local Asian market that's around the corner here. This one is called mekaboo. There's a bunch of different varieties of seaweed, and so if you're curious about what type of seaweed is appropriate to supplement for a little bit of iodine, highly recommend to check out the details on nutritionfacts.org under the thyroid health article. In particular, watch out for kelp. So kelp is extremely high in iodine. In fact, it's very easy to overdose on the iodine by eating kelp. So use that one with caution, but a lot of the other ones that are sold as little seaweed snacks, wakame and so forth, are very healthy as well. In fact, my only complaint with some of the seaweed snacks is a lot of them do contain oils and such, which are really not too good for you in other aspects of health, and so trying to find versions that are like this, that are just the seaweed without the extra accoutrements can be helpful. So too much or too little iodine can really disrupt the thyroid, and some people find iodine solutions. A friend of mine has this J. Crow's Lugol solution, and so even just gargling with something like this can lead to way too much absorption. I think the way that she was using was just like a couple drops every once in a great while. I don't know if that's the best way of using it. I highly would recommend discussing the details of all that with your primary care doctor if you're curious, or just simply get one of those little supplements. This is, again, one of the few supplements I do recommend. There is a Thyroid Association that has put out some guidelines for women who are plant-based of childbearing age. They recommend having 150 mcg or micrograms of iodine a day, basically to make sure that if a baby is coming along, that that baby has full amount of iodine available, so its developing thyroid gland can function normally and make for a proper nervous system and other development. So the two seaweeds to really watch out for or avoid are kelp and hiziki, Hiziki. Otherwise, most of the seaweeds are pretty good iodine sources as well. So there's a whole bunch of different kind of chemicals in our environment that can impact on the thyroid function. For example, there's a chemical called triclosan, which is found commonly in antibiotic soaps and, believe it or not, in toothpaste. And that's one chemical that, when it gets absorbed, sometimes can mess up with the thyroid function a little bit. Alkylphenols, flame retardant chemicals, purofluorochemicals, and industrial pollutants of various sorts. The main sources that we get all these fun environmental toxins are in the food supply, especially in fish and in meats still. And so that's associated with thyroid dysfunction in young children and adults. And there's some interesting things about some of the antibodies that are in meats. And basically there's one called alpha-gal, again, more details on nutrition facts, that can help trigger our bodies to create autoimmune conditions, including creating antibodies against your own thyroid hormone and thyroid function. So that's the most common problem that people have with their thyroids, is their body is making antibodies against it. And we'll go into more in that in a little bit. Artificial food coloring. So there is a food coloring dye that is well known to cause trouble with the thyroid, particularly red number 3. So red number 3, too much seaweed of any type, and more details on Gregor's thing, and processed meat consumption. So that's your bolognas, your sausages, your bacons, any lunch meats that are out there. All of those have been linked with an increase in thyroid cancers in general. And then final thing is virus exposure. So there is a group of workers that is exposed to a lot of chicken. And so poultry workers, either people who are butchering in the back shops of the supermarkets, or the people that are on those assembly lines dealing with the meats, or the people that are dealing with the chickens directly, there are some viruses that can be transmitted from the chickens to the humans that seem to be related to the thyroid dysfunction as well. So chickens and turkeys seem to be carriers of these as well. So there's a bunch of different things that you can do through food to help with the thyroid. Different resource, I believe it was the whfoods.org website, if I remember right, had an article about Brazil nuts or basically selenium and thyroid health. I might not have that exactly memorized correctly, so I'll double check afterwards and try to find the source of this tidbit if I can. But there's some information that if somebody has enough selenium in the diet, that it is useful for the thyroid function. And so one little tip is Brazil nuts, these little guys, are actually really loaded down with selenium. And matter of fact, one of the first random tidbits that they taught us in my medical school in Albany was that if you ate like 17 Brazil nuts, you're going to have like way overdosed of selenium. And so it's one of those few vitamins that has a very narrow therapeutic range, like too little is not so good, too much is really not so good. And so literally having 1 or 2 of these a day should give you enough selenium to continue to maintain your thyroid function as well, and just kind of help support things a little bit in that department. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close down this particular episode and then just restart with a little bit more on this topic, just to kind of try to break these talks up into smaller chunks for folks when they're looking at it later. So, Tom, thank you for joining. Please hang on for about 2 seconds and then come right back in, and I'll see you in just a few more minutes. Okay, bye-bye.